Very warm welcome back to Traquair. This is a great festival. I'm very pleased to be here. My connection with Iraq, if I have one, is that I was there in 1991 during the first Gulf War, reporting from Baghdad, and I was back there in the immediate aftermath of the 2003 invasion, when everything started going wrong. General Sir Mike Jackson was head of the British Army until retiring in 2007. Jane Kinninmont is from Chatham House and has just finished a report on this. And Sir Kieran Prendergast was a career British diplomat, ambassador in Turkey, High Commissioner in Zimbabwe and Kenya, and spent 8 years working for the UN. In 2003, he was Under Secretary for Political Affairs and disagreed with the Iraq invasion. He opposed the war. Let me start with you, Jane, since you've just finished this report. What are the before we talk about Syria, what are the broad lessons we've learned over the last 10 years?
I think when we look at what went wrong in Iraq, it's important to look back even further than 2003. And I don't want to terrify you all by making you think I'm going to give an endlessly long answer. We heard from William Dalrymple earlier some of the interesting parallels between the imperial adventures in Afghanistan and the more recent ones. And historians of Iraq, especially Peter Sluglet, have made some similar comparisons with British imperial misbehaviour in Iraq and mistakes that were subsequently repeated. But I'm not going to give you that full sweep of history. But many of the problems that we've seen since 2003 do have their roots also in the previous brutal dictatorship, which was for a long time supported by the West. A blind eye was turned to what's now been recognised as genocide. The role of the most devastating sanctions the world has ever seen in creating corruption, empowering violent militias, and decimating Iraq's middle class all need to be taken into account. In terms of the post-invasion, there's been catalogues of mistakes that have been written about. I might pick out two in particular here. One being not a great idea to disband the army, but let them all go home with nothing but their guns. Number two would be about the way that we think of democracy. And I think it's entirely wrong to think that the Iraq War was fundamentally about democracy, but it was an important part of the narrative, and there was an ideology from the US side at the time which included a kind of marriage between democracy and free markets, which is something that's not necessarily accepted around the world. And to think that a government can have legitimacy through the ballot box without being able to provide people with security or even electricity has proven profoundly fallacious. I think that's one of the things where there have been some lessons learned in the way we think about political legitimacy.
It's hard to escape the conclusion from what you've just said that the principal lesson learned is that it was ill-considered from the beginning and it should just never have happened.
I was, a student protester demonstrating against the war at the time, but I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the 10 years debate in the UK has been almost a self-congratulation by the left. We were right, this should never have happened. Problematic and illegal as it was, there is also a need to try to not make Iraq just a bad memory that makes us feel guilty, but to try to think about how you could support the building of a state that is actually peaceful.
Yeah, we want to come on to that question in a minute, the question of whether the Iraq experience, awful that it's been, now constrains us from taking on projects which might be themselves be good. Now, but the Iraq experience stops us doing it. But General Sir Mike, an acquaintance of mine in Washington in 2003 likened the atmosphere in George Bush's administration to Iran. He said, you've got the mullahs and the pragmatists. The mullahs are the true believers, and they are Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and so on. They are the true believers. And you've got the pragmatists, the Colin Powells and the State Department and the CIA, actually. And the pragmatists lost the war to the mullahs. People often say the problem was there was no plan for the aftermath of the invasion. There was a plan. It was called the Future of Iraq Plan. But the Bush administration didn't implement it. Don Rumsfeld, in effect, put it in the bucket, didn't he? Were you aware of all that at the time?
Yes. But if I can just echo, and I don't want to go back forever either, but Iraq did not start in 2002-3. It started over a decade before, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in a flagrant breach of international law. That is where the saga begins. And indeed, to those in my old game, they're known as shorthand Gulf 1, Gulf 2. And you can argue that it was actually one conflict, but was interspersed by a decade of very uneasy, there was air policing, so-called, during that decade. Because Gulf 1 was militarily decisive in that he was kicked out of Kuwait. It was not politically decisive. And hence this long period. And if I may, whilst I'm on this, people say, well, we didn't get the second United Nations Security Council resolution. It was only the second in British domestic politics. It would have been the 18th resolution, which Saddam Hussein ignored throughout those 12 years or so. And you might well ask, how long do you allow somebody like that to continue in defiance of the United Nations, which is not perfect, as we all know, but it's what we have. Then, taking up your point, the mullahs...
Yeah, let's not get hung up on whether the war was legitimate or not. Let's concentrate on what happened afterwards, yeah. Please go on.
Well, it's been one of the big issues surrounding it.
Yeah.
In my view, it was legal. We can argue whether it was legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
Kosovo, with which I was somewhat involved a little earlier, was quite clearly illegal, but most people thought it was legitimate. Those two things are not necessarily two sides of the same coin. The mullahs, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, can I remember them all? Cheney, Rumsfeld, Schweitz, and number four, Wolfowitz. I remember being asked, before action was taken, very early, therefore, in 2003, is this doable? I said, to defeat Saddam Hussein's regime is entirely doable in a military sense. It's what you then put in its place. Because you create, and the roll call is quite a long one. Interventions, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Sierra Leone, East Timor, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. We helped the French in Mali. It's quite a long roll call. And if you do take over a country in this intervening way, you are then stuck with it, and rightly. And there was a plan for what was known in the trade as Phase 4, Phase 3 being the military maneuver. I can't remember what Phases 1 and 2 were now, but never mind. Phase 4 was planned by the State Department, the US Foreign Office. And very early in 2003, the leader of the Four Horsemen, one Donald Rumsfeld, persuaded, cajoled, I don't know what he did, with the president to move that planning responsibility from the State Department to the Pentagon, and it then went into the dustbin, and it was tragic for Iraq.
And when did you find out that had happened, and were you alarmed by it?
Well, without doubt, I was alarmed by it. When did I find them? I think within hours of the decision being announced.
And was there alarm in Downing Street? Was Tony Blair alarmed by it?
Well, he was Prime Minister at the time. But our voice, I think, saying, are you sure you want to do this? Because the downside could be very considerable. That voice didn't appear to be heard in Washington. Not only the disbandment of the Iraqi army and police, but the so-called de-Ba'athification of the administration. And, you're a young school teacher. You carry a Ba'ath Party card to get a job. I don't mean to say you're a great believer in Saddam Hussein, but they all got the heave-ho on the fiat coming out of Washington.
If the State Department had won that battle in Washington, Do you think it would have been substantially different? Would
Well,
it?
we'll never know. Historical ifs are unknowable by definition, but I would have thought Iraq would have stood a far greater chance of moving out of a tyrannical authoritarian regime more quickly than it did.
So, Kieran, you, in effect, this brought your career at the UN to an end, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, yeah.
Tell me what happened.
Well, I think, first of all, we should talk a tiny bit about the context. I was very curious about what happened in Iraq because with Kofi Annan I met all of the Israeli prime ministers during the previous 6 years, and not a single one of them urged any action in relation to Iraq. Why? Because Iraq was in a box, weak and contained. They weren't worried about Iraq, they were worried about Iran. And I think you can only understand what happened in Iraq by reference to the overall approach of the neocons who are in such a dominant position in the Bush administration. If any of you are interested in reading, there's plenty of documents about something which is called Project for a New American Century. And the idea was that at the beginning of the 21st century, the United States was in a unique position of military, economic, political power, and that this power should be used in order to create a new post-Cold War order. At the beginning, the focus was on China, and the concern was that China was the emerging global power, but with 9/11, it changed almost overnight to the need to bring about regime change among Islamic regimes which were considered to be a threat to the United States. I mean, the aim was not a bad aim. The aim was to try to spread democracy throughout the world more widely. But the problem was that the concept of democracy was an American model of democracy. It was coercive. There was a Manichaean approach. It was seen as a struggle between good and evil. And instead of what diplomats would advocate, which is an effort to get bad regimes to reform or to engage in transition, as in Syria at the moment, the idea was that you simply had to overthrow them, and Iraq was the place to start. I think it was done by, I mean, this morning I was quite struck. William Dalrymple said that Jack Straw had come to him and said that he'd wished he'd read the latest book on Afghanistan before. So you had ignorance, you also had arrogance. It's all right wishing to do good, but you have to understand the limitations of political force. I personally have no quarrel whatsoever with the armed forces of the United States or the United Kingdom. They were acting under political orders, but I have a big quarrel with their political masters. And I think the other phrase, the other term that William referred to this morning was ideology. And ideology is a bad basis for foreign policy. Foreign policy action should be taken on the basis of interests and a realistic assessment of consequences. And I don't think that happened in Iraq, at least at the level of the politicians. I hope and expect that the military would have been pointing out the downside, the possible upside. I'm not sure my old Foreign Office pointed out enough where British interests lay, because the debate tended to be phrased in terms of the Americans are intending to do this, what should we do? How should we follow? Rather than where do British interests lie? I personally knew a whole year beforehand how the game would end, because it was quite clear from contacts in Washington and contacts I had with the murkier side of the British foreign policy establishment that there was a determination to bring about one way or another regime change. And there was a rolling policy. You hoped for a coup, you put on pressure with the aim of producing a coup, you introduce special forces to increase the pressure, but if necessary, you ended up with military action. I don't believe there is any historical precedent for shipping 250,000 men from one theatre to another with enormous quantities of armaments and materiel, and then shipping them back again, back to the original theatre. It's not like the grand old Duke of York marching his men up to the top and then back again. So the game was predetermined, and the whole exercise of resolutions and so on was a shell game, really. If I may just disagree very slightly with you, General, on the question of resolutions, I was in the Security Council when the first resolution was passed, the one which was the last one before the war, and at the end of it, the British ambassador and the American ambassador made explanations of vote in which they said that they wished to make clear that this resolution was not a trigger for any kind of war against Iraq. They quite clearly had to do it, because otherwise the Russians and the Chinese...
1441.
Yeah, they wouldn't have gone along with the resolution without it, but it was quite
fair,
clearly...
it was the 17th in sequence, starting with
Sure,
6,
But there's
7, 8.
something important about Resolution 1441, and that is that it warns Iraq of,
It does.
quote, serious consequences
Correct.
Yeah.
if they continue failing to comply with previous resolutions. It didn't warn explicitly of military action.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the explanation of vote by the two Western members of the Security Council explicitly did say this is not a trigger, and this cannot be construed as a trigger. And actually, I think I thought the Security Council was quite often very weak, but the fact that the world superpower, along with good old Britain and one African country and Bulgaria, I think, were the only 4 out of 15 who would vote for a resolution, told us really quite a lot. It also told us quite a lot that when Mr. Al-Baradei and Hans Blitz came to the Council to present their work programme to follow up 1441, that was the very day that the ambassador said, that's enough, I'm sorry, it's too late, the die is cast, which told us that we weren't really serious on the issue of implementing security resolutions. The decision had already been taken, and as David Manning put in a report to Tony Blair after a visit to Washington, the facts are being shaped to fit the conclusion already reached.
And what about the points raised by General Sir Mike and Jane that if the Future of Iraq plan had been implemented, if the army hadn't been disbanded, if there hadn't been that ideologically driven de-Baathification, things might have turned out differently?
I think if we'd taken things more seriously, I mean, you can't say that Syria is to leave weapon dumps unguarded all over Iraq. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld is a very, very interesting man. I don't actually put him with the others. I don't think he was a classic neocon. I mean, I think he was a classic 19th century liberal. I think what he wanted to do, his concept was get in, knock them out, get out. Whereas the neocon vision was much more ambitious than that. It was get in, create a new Iraq, a West-friendly, Israel-friendly democracy, which is a hugely ambitious program of social engineering, which was bound to go utterly wrong. The other thing that we lack, and we would have lacked even if that program had been part implemented, was we lack patience and we lack stamina. In the UN Secretariat, we warned against rushing through on a predetermined program, particularly in relation to things like the new constitution. Constitutions are good or bad or indifferent in pretty direct proportion to the amount of time you allow for real consultation and discussion, but there was this program. I mean, there was this phase, 3 months for this, 2 months for that, 3 months for that, and it was just, we've got the program, we're going to do it, and if you like, don't worry about the consequences.
But I suppose what I'm asking you is, because this is Iraq 10 years on, lessons learned,
Yeah.
Regardless of what you see as the charade of those attempts to get UN Security Council resolutions, given that it was going to happen, when it did happen, could it have been salvaged? Could the project have been salvaged if the aftermath had been handled differently?
Well, the general very rightly ducked the question, because how can you know what would have happened?
Ducked is not knowable.
Yeah,
One
okay,
can
but
surmise.
well, you declined to answer the question. My view, very, very rightly, and I'd like to do so. I would say the lesson is completely different, which is please understand the limits of military action. Please understand the complexities of society. Please understand the doctrine of unpredictable consequences, that if you go in and you overturn balances which have been reached, I mean, in Syria, for example, over centuries, you are likely to create an unmanageable, unsalvageable mess.
Jane, what has been the consequence of the trauma of the Iraq experience on foreign policy making and security policy making in the Western democracies and on the way the UN acts?
This has been a huge blow to the limited credibility that the idea of humanitarian intervention has had. We see that now with the debate over Syria. We saw it a lot nearer the time with the international debates over Darfur, where the frustration and cynicism and disappointment within the UN over Iraq immediately played out when it came to international action on Sudan. Libya seems to have been a complete one-off, enabled by the fact that Gaddafi was the most friendless leader in the world and nobody wanted to really stick up for him. But especially in the US, the entire Syria debate seems to be coloured by Iraq. The most extreme example I've seen is a piece by Tom Friedman with the wonderful title in the New York Times, "Syria is Iraq," which is kind of unbeatable. But I think there have been all these fears about, whether the US can, or whether the West can actually intervene in a way that achieves the goals. Nonetheless, there is still a desire to shape outcomes in the region, but the tendency with Syria seems to have been essentially to try to delegate the problem to local actors who don't actually have the capacity or the legitimacy either to fix it. So there was all these hopes, Turkey, the Gulf, the Arab League, they all succeed in Syria, and no one's been able to.
So this project that Kieran mentioned, the project for a new American century, the idea that America could take advantage of its unchallengeable status as the world's last remaining superpower, has in fact weakened America on the world stage. The Iraq experience has weakened America on the world stage, hasn't it?
Some historians see Gulf I as the beginning of a unipolar US period in the Middle East, end of the Cold War, unrivaled US military dominance. US is the upholder of the international order. And Iraq may have been the beginning of the end of that period.
General Sir Mike, there was talk of this even before the Bush administration came to power in 2000, in the war that you fought in Kosovo, which was, as you say, was a legitimate conflict, if not, perhaps not even legal. But I remember Wesley Clark talking about rolling forward the frontiers of Jeffersonian democracy in the Balkan Peninsula.
Yes.
Did you? Is that what you thought you were doing?
Not exactly. But then I did always agree with the good General Clark.
I remember.
But more seriously, an intervention needs very clear political objectives that we need. Soldiers need very clear political objectives. Clausewitz, we always finish up going back to Clausewitz. The use of force is politics by extreme means. My words, but that's his sense. But what political objectives are you seeking to achieve? And then we can work out military objectives which push forward those political objectives. But as Kieran said a moment ago, this is not just a job for soldiers or anything like it. If you are going to remove some tyrant, some dictator, you are going to have to think very hard about how you run that country. In some cases, after decades of one person being there. How are you going to do it? And as I say, this is not just a job for soldiers, all far from it. And it's not really, once you have dealt with the regime's armed forces, the military piece is largely over. And it is Pache, Rumsfeld and co. nation building, which he, of course, loathes the phrase.
And was there any talk about the point that Jane made right at the start, that what you had was a very degraded urban, very cowed, intimidated, degraded urban middle class in Iraq? That's always going to be the bedrock of a successful future democracy. Was there any talk of the structure of Iraqi society, what had happened to Iraqi society under the Ba'athist regime all those decades? Was there any talk of that at all in the political leadership who were deciding these affairs?
Not the best witness to that. I mean, there was a sense, a program, but it was, as Kieran has said, it was very mechanistic. This is what's going to happen. It doesn't matter what the people feel about it. This is what we're going to do. And, from the initial euphoria, certainly in the south, the largely Shia south, who'd been given such a hard time by Saddam Hussein, were very pleased to see us at the beginning.
The very beginning.
At the beginning.
mean, I was in Baghdad just a few days after the statue came down. There was one day when in retrospect, this event illustrates more than we perhaps understood at the time, although we did understand what was happening. There was an arms dump in a Baghdad suburb which blew up, and it devastated the neighborhood, and several houses that had survived the war were flattened and all the people in them killed. Well, within about an hour of that event happening, there were organized demonstrations with properly printed placards and unfurled banners blaming the Americans. And what was clear was that there was an undercurrent of anti-American sentiment just waiting to be tapped, waiting to be used. And the people who were using it were the only people who were there to fill the power vacuum were the clerics. They were the only people, and were the Muslim clerics, they were the only people who still commanded popular public trust. So it was obvious from very, very early on, Sir Kieran, that this was the shape it was going to take.
Well, I went to Jordan for a World Economic Summit conference in between the end of the war and the bombing of our compound, which, by the way, is 10 years ago in 2 days' time, when we lost 24 dead, including a possible future UN Secretary General. So the implications for us were very considerable, both in terms of now we're crippled by security concerns everywhere, which means we don't operate as effectively in that kind of conflict situation. And also maybe, who knows, Sergio Vieira de Mello might be UN Secretary General now, because he was an extremely credible candidate. Anyway, while Kofi was giving Sergio lunch, I took Hassan Salame, who was his deputy, former Lebanese minister, to lunch to talk to him. He was very worried. He was an Arab, and of course in intense contact with Iraqis. He said he was very worried because they felt that the regime had been defeated, but they had not been defeated because the army hadn't a lot of them hadn't fought. They had received mobile telephone calls from American CIA or military Arabic-speaking officers who had told them that if you put your tanks in a circle facing inwards, gun down, we won't attack you, and you will be looked after. And then they were suddenly told, bugger off, basically, you are unemployable, you're not going to get a pension and so on. And of course they were very angry, and they said, this is not Germany 1945, this is not Japan 1945. They feel the regime has been defeated, they have not been defeated, but they have been betrayed. So that laid the...
And humiliated.
And humiliated. This laid the foundations for a well-organized resistance. But look, on the business of what should be different and how might we do it next time, I think you've got to note the absence of the sort of rebalancing event which has happened after every major change in world politics since the early 19th century. So at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you had the Congress of Vienna. At the end of the First World War, you had the Congress of Versailles. In 1945, you had San Francisco, which led to the United Nations and the Security Council. At the end of the Cold War, you had this neocon project, but you haven't had any balancing events, so you don't have agreed rules of the road. And the United States is there, but Russia and China are, and therefore the permanent 5 members of the Security Council are largely absent. And I would suggest that we think about how different it would be if we had agreed rules of the road, rules of engagement, rules of what's on and what's not on, as a way of restoring at least some measure of collective security. I mean, how much easier would it be to deal with Syria, for example? I know we're going to come on to that. If, in fact, there was a much closer working relationship between the United States and Russia and the other members of the permanent 5. But at the moment, the system is totally unbalanced. You used to have a bipolar system. So if you like, you had one superpower pulling at each end of the rope. Now you've got someone pulling on one end of the rope, nobody pulling at the other, and the system is unbalanced. And I think that's part of the reason why things have gone so wrong, because there wasn't that inhibiting factor or that correcting factor or that incentive to reach agreement.
And has the the trauma of the Iraq experience constrained policy making in America, in Britain?
Well, if you look at the United States, they're moving back into what is their default mode, which is isolation, withdrawal. In Britain, I'm not sure that, we keep making, it's like Groundhog Day, you keep making the same mistake. I mean, I hear on good authority that it's only, your successors who've stopped David Cameron from doing some foolish military intervention on Syria. And I think every ambassador, every retired ambassador who's been consulted has said, for Christ's sake, don't do it.
But they all said that in 2003 as well, didn't they?
Yeah, but there is this. Yeah, but that was after the event, and it's no good having a. I mean, I had an argument with a Labour peeress when one of Mark Muller's events, because she said, yeah, but the system worked perfectly because we had a debate in Parliament and we had a large majority and so on. So I said, it's not really very reassuring, because what you had the form working, but the substance not working. You had the majority of the country, huge demonstrations against, many people with private concerns, but the thing went through.
Is that entirely fair? I mean,
I'm not seeking to be fair.
No. Well, to be accurate. My recollection is that in early 2003, the opinion polls were about 2-1 in favour of action. That reversed over time for the reasons which we've been discussing. But I think it's important. I think you were intimating that Parliament was out of step with public opinion.
Public opinion supported
it was
war
not.
at the time.
Sorry, that is a misconception.
What about these huge demonstrations?
Yes. Yeah, but what about all the people who were for it but didn't demonstrate? I'm sorry, you cannot judge from the number of people on the streets one way or the other.
The opinion polls were pretty clear.
But we do need to look also at the role of misinformation in the decision-making of Parliament and the public, the dodgy intelligence.
Yeah.
I was in New York, and I must say I was extremely concerned at the wave of patriotic exultation that carried away. I went to a thing run by Brookings, and it was discussing a book by a couple of neo-connish authors who did put in all of the cons as well as the pros, but in the enthusiasm it was kind of surging forward, and the cons were just brushed aside.
Jane, comment on Sir Kieran's point about the lack of a kind of Congress of Vienna moment that establishes the rules that everybody signs up to.
Well, it's interesting because I think we do have an informal rebalancing of US power in terms of the world's economic shift. The US doesn't have the same capacity or standing, but there hasn't been that shift or change reflected in terms of the global governance system. And it's increasingly clear over Syria how badly hamstrung that is.
What should we be doing about Syria?
This is a huge question with another long answer, which I feel I don't fully have. I think the prospect for international intervention to make things worse there is very, very real. I don't see how there can be a diplomatic solution without bringing in, however distasteful it might be to the West, without bringing in Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I'm not still hugely optimistic about that. But I think if you're going to try a diplomatic solution, it does actually have to involve the parties that are at war with each other.
We learned in many instances after the end of the Cold War, the diplomatic solution that wasn't backed by the credible threat of force was often kind of pointless. I mean, Bosnia was a great, and Kosovo, General Samai. Unless it's predicated on an ultimate willingness to use force, it doesn't have any teeth, does it?
Yes, the analogy which I quite like is that of a very fine and elegant velvet glove, the diplomacy. Without anything inside it, you can crumple it. But if you've got an armed fist in there, you don't probably have to take the glove off at all, because it's there.
But the reality is, largely because of Iraq, the prospects of military intervention sponsored by the Western democracies is almost zero, isn't it? We're not going to do it,
No, I see no political appetite either side of the Atlantic for further military involvement, although one has to be very careful. When you say military involvement, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a full-scale ground force going in there to A, stop the war, B, get rid of Assad or whomever it may be, or are we talking about the establishment perhaps of a secure humanitarian area where relief workers can do their job without threat of violence against them? So that needs definition. My concern, I think, is that given where we are, that the next time a government, and ours is an obvious one here, a government needs to make a political decision, a strategic, using the word properly, a strategic decision as to whether to threaten or to use military force to change circumstances on the ground. I hope it can be looked at dispassionately and not necessarily through the electoral prism as it's now seen of Iraq in particular.
So, Kieran.
The UN used to sometimes say that the choice was between the plague and cholera. And I think there are elements of that in Syria. The regime is certainly not appetizing, and large and increasing elements of the opposition are not appetizing. I have not seen from the opposition recently any credible vision or attractive vision for a future Syria. I'm associated with a company that's been asked by the Foreign Office to help advise the Syrian opposition for the Geneva conference if it happens. And my view has been, how can you advise them when they don't know what they want themselves? I mean, you can only construct a communication strategy with people who've actually got a strategy. And such as it is, a lot of it is destructive. I think that the military option is a chimera, really, because Western armed forces they're depleted in terms of capacity. They're a bit exhausted. They're overstretched. It's enormously expensive. And what exactly, as General Mike says, what exactly would they do? What exactly would they do? With what effect? And would that make things better, or would it make them worse? My own view is that there is no alternative to the United States beginning to work properly with the Russians. And for the Russians, it's clear that the way that decisions are taken is almost as important as the substance of the decisions. So they want to be involved in a real sense in decision making, not just presented with something as a fait accompli. Also, language matters to them. Regime change is anathema as a term. Negotiated transition is not. Now, what are we talking about? It's not actually up to us to decide whether the Syrians want the Assad regime or some other form of government or some other regime. It's actually up to the Syrians. So negotiated transition offers everybody what they want. There's been a proposal for some form of technocratic government to take office, with or without Assad as nominal president, leading up to internationally supervised elections when the Syrian people could decide what they want. A major problem with all these conflicts is that the party that feels it's winning never wants to negotiate. So when the opposition seemed to be sweeping all before them, they were refusing to have anything to do with the regime, unless at least as a minimum Assad left. Now the government are on the upswing, and they are not keen on negotiating with the opposition. So the only way you can deal with this is to find parties that will agree with you to put pressure on both sides, and that involves the Russians and, as you say, Jane, the Iranians. Why should that be distasteful? The Iranians have interests. They're a near neighbour. They've got clear interests, and it's better to have them, as Lyndon Johnson would have said, inside the tent, shall we say, looking out, than outside the tent looking in, when they'll make trouble.
Just one last question about, do you think it's widely understood here just how profoundly suspiciously the Russians see what has happened in the world over the last 20 years? I mean, if you talk to anybody close to Putin, the Putin circle genuinely believes that all these color-coordinated revolutions that have happened on Russia's doorstep, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, any number of them, they are CIA plots in the minds of the Russian ruling establishment. And what they see is the steady advance of American or Western power right to Russia's very borders, and even in the old Soviet Union. Overcoming that is a generational task, isn't it?
Yeah, but, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, is a very rational and balanced and hard-headed person. He was Russian ambassador to the UN for almost the entire time I was there, so I saw him in action often. And what struck me more than anything else was that the Russians attach enormous importance to their position as a permanent member of the Security Council. And because it's their seat at the top table, regardless of economic weakness or anything else. If that is taken lightly, they will make you pay for it. And it has been taken lightly. And I think some of the actions, there was a brief reference to Libya. I personally think that that NATO drove a coach and horses through the Security Council resolution that the Russians were persuaded to abstain on, because it was not a resolution for regime change, it was a resolution for protection of the civilian population with no ground troops.
So you think we betrayed the Russians then?
I think we played fast and loose with the resolution, and they're not stupid. I mean, what they say, fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me. And the trouble with that sort of thing is it has a cumulative effect and it makes it more difficult to get them on board next time. But Lavrov is a pragmatist; he's a realist, and it is not impossible to re-engage them. About the other revolutions, I'm not qualified to speak with him.
Let's get some questions from you now. Have we got a roving mic? Yeah, there's a couple there, first of all.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. And the one point I would challenge there is Sir Michael Jackson's argument that somehow there is a sort of continuity between the Gulf Wars. I mean, it seems to me Gulf I was utterly defensible in terms of our political objectives, a coherent exit strategy, and totally defensible. We had to get him out of Kuwait, full stop. The difference with the later war, to me, is that when I was in Iraq for over a year in 79-80, we were utterly familiar with evidence, and so was the British Embassy, of torture and everything else going on. It was totally common knowledge. We had first-hand information on it. Total hypocrisy by the politicians later under Blair, as if it was some sort of new thing. They would have been briefed on it at least a decade earlier, 2 decades earlier almost. So to me, it's Gulf II, the final Gulf War that comes about for reasons that are completely indefensible, really, very poor coherent thinking strategically.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you now because I think we've got the point.
That's the problem.
Yeah, General Sir Mike. In what sense is Gulf II simply Chapter 2 in the same story as Gulf I?
Well, it depends a lot on perception, and you have a very clear one. I'm afraid mine differs in the way that I laid out, because what Saddam Hussein did in autumn 2000, God, it's so long ago now, autumn 1990, go back a decade, the invasion of Kuwait, was an outrageous and flagrant breach of international law, for which he did not really suffer. He got kicked out, but there was no penalty. And if you remember, we had to impose an air exclusion zone on the south to protect the Shia population from recrimination, and we had to do the same in the north to protect the Kurds. And if you say to an RAF pilot during those 10 years or so, everything's fine, we're at peace, when he gets shot at every time he flies, this is not a stable situation.
But surely the point was, I remember it, and perhaps Sir Kieran should answer this, is that the resolutions that were passed in the wake of 1991 and to which Saddam Hussein signed up in the famous signature, not him personally, but there was a signed document in a tent at Safwan.
687.
And Resolution 687 required Saddam Hussein to make certain commitments before peace could be fully declared. Those commitments were never made.
He
were
was
they?
in breach from
Yeah.
the word go. He was
Oh.
in breach of international law by doing it in the first place, and then the ceasefire, underlying ceasefire, not a settlement,
Yeah.
a ceasefire, endorsed by 687, on conditions, as you say, none of which I can see that he complied
And
with.
so the American
So he
view-
was basically two fingers all the time to the UN.
And the American view, certainly the George Bush view, was that the 1991 war hadn't yet ended in 2003.
Well,
it was still ongoing. We've got a question there.
Yeah, for me,
We've got another.
for me, the most serious thing that we need to look at seriously. Sorry.
Just can you go ahead?
The thing we
Can
need
you
to
point the
look at
microphone into your mouth? Yeah.
is,
It's not on, I
the
don't
thing
think.
that we need to look at most seriously in respect of Iraq is detail. And the only point of detail we haven't talked about the senior clerics and the US's approach to senior clerics. The only detail we've had was the ridiculous disbandment of the armed forces. I'm not going to go on to other details that we should have looked at, but I do want to pick Sir Kieran up on, frankly, a dangerous statement that we shouldn't hold the armed forces accountable for criticism. I think everyone agrees that at major level and below, the actions of our armed forces in Iraq and Afghanistan have been exemplary. But Sherard Cooper-Coles very strongly makes the point in Cables from Kabul, his book on Afghanistan, that both British and American forces should be held accountable at senior levels for serious shortcomings in Afghanistan. And I think from Flodden to the charge of the Light Brigade to Arnhem, it is an absolute imperative importance that we do hold politicians accountable at the top, but that we also hold senior military figures also accountable for their mistakes. So Mike, what would you say in Iraq, which I'm less well informed on than Afghanistan, what would you say your personal failings were? And secondly, should you have known better?
Well, how long we got? An hour or so? I hear you. I can assure you that the British Armed Forces will do their duty by direction of the duly elected government with what they have at the time. And perfection is not on offer. Have military mistakes been made? With hindsight, yes. You can say that. But if you are saying that the senior leadership of the armed forces were a load of dunces, which you imply, you are wrong, sir.
I simply make the point. I'm not saying that. I mean, to take the example of Afghanistan, I think the rotation of entire battalions in and out of Afghanistan, so there was no continuity of senior military leadership on the British side between rotations of battalions in and out of Afghanistan was a massive mistake.
Yeah.
It was made to the military, and they refused to change it.
Okay.
with
Okay.
the army.
It's a matter of judgment. Generals do a year to 18 months in Afghanistan,
They do now.
So Kieran,
and they
do you want to
were
comment on
doing
this?
then.
So I think
You
I want
go
to stay
back.
out of this one. But I do want to say that for all the criticisms I felt about the way in which process was manipulated in Iraq, when the war was going on, I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and turn on the TV because, if we were going to be there, we had to win. Your remarks are about Afghanistan rather than Iraq. And personally, as a British subject, I feel bitterly the loss of every single British serviceman. What I was saying really was I don't blame the army leadership for this at all, because the people to be blamed for this are the politicians who sent them there. And my view is that if we are to put lives at risk of our soldiers, there has to be a really, really serious reason to do it. And it was not the disarmament of Iraq. It was about regime change.
You know what? You've really had a good say, and there are other people who want to get in. I do apologise to you because you make a very important point. We've got a point down here.
Just to take that point forward, and quoting Sherard Cooper-Coles in Cables from Kabul, he had an interesting criticism which I'd like to just throw at the general, just see what you react to it. He said there's something in the military mind that refuses to sort of be beaten down by problems, which is obviously a good thing. You try and solve a problem. He said, however bad things were, the generals would always say, well, we have problems, but things are improving, even when it was quite obvious that things were actually going down the plug hole very fast. Is that a fair criticism or not, do you think?
Well, it's his criticism.
Well, that's what he says, yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well-
do you agree with it? Do you think that,
No, I don't
that
agree.
people would
No,
admit
you
when
wouldn't
things were
expect
going
me.
badly wrong?
No,
that-
you wouldn't expect me to agree with it.
Anyway,
And I think the impression given that you get to major and you're a great chap, and as soon as you get lieutenant colonel, you become an idiot. I mean, this is nonsensical. This is absolutely nonsensical. You go into very difficult, complex situations. There is no template. You are having to make some very difficult judgments, probably on, certainly on imperfect information, probably on quite sketchy or false information at times. Yes, people with hindsight can say, well, why did they do that? Why didn't they do the other? Because they did that at the time, because that's what seemed the best course of action. This is not stupidity. It's not even, in my view, flawed judgment. It's trying to do something very difficult in very complex circumstances. And but very often you're in a bit of a no-win anyway, because whatever you do is going to have a reaction in some other way, and balancing all of that off is quite tricky.
Let's get a question from up there.
Nobody's perfect.
Microphone's gone off. Yeah, just there's another one coming. We were supposed to finish at 5 if anybody's anxious to get away, but I'm going to keep it going for another 10 minutes because we started so late, if that's all right with everybody.
Yes, to Mr. Jackson. Do future wars will be about water?
Do I want to say?
Will future wars be about water?
I hope not. I'd love to believe the second coming was around the corner, and that we would all love each other forevermore throughout this tortured planet. However, I'm afraid the realist in me says that we are still fallen, and people are too ready to use violence to settle political differences when there are other ways, and resource differences, perhaps. So if you are putting forward the hypothesis that access to water not only could, but in one or two places already is a source of conflict, I fear you are right.
Jane.
I'm sad to say.
I think it's absolutely true that already these sorts of issues, including competition over water, contribute to conflicts. Even in Syria, you know, the mainstream narrative of the Syria conflict over here now seems to be this is an ideological sectarian battle between different religious groups who just randomly suddenly happen to hate each other. And there's a total failure to analyse some of the factors that have destabilised the country, which do include a drought that has impoverished rural areas in Syria just at a time when an urban elite associated with the very corrupt regime was becoming increasingly conspicuously rich. And there is a class conflict element to the struggle that's almost entirely ignored over here.
Resource competition, Sir Kieran.
Well, when I was at the United Nations, we used to have lunchtime seminars from time to time. We'd bring an expert in, and one of the ones I brought in was on the subject of water wars. And water is, particularly in the Middle East, an increasingly difficult and dangerous area. You just got to look at the comparative consumption of water by Israelis and by Palestinians, and the use of the reservoirs and so on. And I was quite struck that I was number 2 in the British Embassy in Tel Aviv from 82 to 86 at the time when there were no peace talks going on between Israelis and Arabs, yet I knew that there was a regular committee that met composed of Israelis and Jordanians to discuss the allocation of water from the Jordan, because it was too important an issue to not to deal with, even in the middle of as it was then, a Cold War.
Have you been to the Dead Sea recently?
Not
I
recently.
mean, it's a
no.
puddle compared to what it used to be.
Way
and
down.
It's really shocking.
Well, look at the Aral Sea too.
Yes, question here.
Just an observation on the outcome in terms of the constitution and politics of states when they're going through enormous conflict. In Iraq, you might say that the outcome is an illiberal democracy, one where the parties, the coalition which won, has been elected in a democratic way, but then governs in a very undemocratic, non-inclusive manner. And we've seen this perhaps in Egypt, where the governing party was similarly elected with a majority and governed in an illiberal manner. I wonder what observations you have on this concept of illiberal democracy.
Yeah, this touches on a point that you made, Jane, about the misconceptions of the nature of democracy. And in fact, the country that you used to be ambassador to, Turkey, is a classic example of this, isn't it? Of illiberal democracy, in the sense of a government with a majority, using that majority to close down other centres of power and impose its will on minorities.
Well, I think we need to discuss that at some length, but...
you clearly don't agree with me.
I think that's not a misdescription. There are plenty of things wrong with Turkey, but it has a very active opposition. It's a multi-party system.
Sure,
It has too high a threshold, an electoral threshold at 10%. So if you don't get 10% of the votes, you don't get any seats in Parliament, but the Kurds get round that by running as independents and then forming a party after the election's over. So it's not an insuperable
Are there illiberal
barrier.
democracies in the world?
Plenty of them, but I think the questioner has the right point. What's the common factor between Iraq and Egypt? They rushed through, in both cases, a constitution, and the Muslim Brotherhood rushed through the constitution in Egypt. They behaved as if there wasn't an opposition. I thought David Aronovich had it quite right in the Times the other day when he said, what a choice between the stupidity of the Brotherhood and the brutality of the military. But certainly the Muslim Brothers made many mistakes. No, the difficulty in Turkey is different. It's the use of pressure on the media to fire. Well, we got one here who. Bejan, are you in the room? Bejan, are you hiding or are you not there? Bejan Matur, who's one of the guests here, resigned from her newspaper because the editor wanted to cut one of her articles, and a number of leading journalists have been fired from their newspapers, but they've all...
And jailed. They're in jail. Journalists are in jail in Turkey.
No, they're in jail for something completely and utterly different. I mean, Alan, you're not, I hope, suggesting that it's okay for journalists to take part in plotting coups.
No, of course not.
Or indeed for generals to take part in plotting coups.
Perish the
thought. But believe it or not, it may shock you to hear this, General Mike, but Turkish generals have done it really quite a few times in the last 50 years.
We tried it about 350 years ago, do you remember? We took the head of a monarch, put a general in charge, and 12 years later decided it was really rather a bad idea. So I think we learnt that lesson a long time back.
Wasn't he also from Lincolnshire? Or was he from Cambridgeshire? I can't remember.
What,
Cromwell.
Let's get a question from the back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what Sir Kieran said about, he brought up the Congress of Vienna and the Treaty of Versailles and what happened after the Second World War. You said San Francisco, but might have said Yalta and the carve-up of spheres of influence. And that what happened after the Second World War surely was more about the rules of a war, the Cold War, which was very bloody at the edges. And what happened after that war was over, and you talk about the one superpower left trailing off the field with the tug-of-war rope, is that we didn't know what to do. So in Bosnia we had what might be called a very strange situation, which hasn't been tried before or repeated since, of the UN refereeing a war, and then gradually coming around to the idea of actual intervention to stop the sort of horrors we saw in Bosnia. And now we've come full circle back to Syria, where it's, for God's sakes, don't get involved, we're going to piss off the Russians and the Chinese. Surely this is where the diplomats and the UN should be involved in sorting this problem out. And it is not a military problem or a problem to take the pressure off the general of what soldiers do, but it's a problem what diplomats have failed to do over the last 25 years to sort this problem out.
Yeah, sure. Let's blame the diplomats. Why not? I don't actually think that the issue is being concerned about pissing off the Russians or the Chinese. The problem is that nobody knows what to do that will make things better in Syria. And my suggestion is that you can only make things better by engaging with everyone who has an interest, because we do, like it or not, have an international system which is based on the United Nations, and the Security Council has the supreme responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And if the Security Council is non-functional because the permanent five are non-functional, then you have a big problem which can only be addressed by trying to restore some harmony to that system. That's not pissing off people, that's actually engaging people, which is, I would have thought, the opposite of pissing them off. But I take your point earlier about Yalta and so on. I'm simply saying that we haven't had any kind of... We tried it, actually. I mean, immediately after Iraq, we got the Secretary-General to write his Fork in the Road speech, and we set up a high-level panel on threats, challenges and change, and we were hoping that this would lay the ground for a kind of new grand bargain. But the view of the Bush administration was, we are not going to be tied down by the Lilliputians. I mean, that's actually a quote, a rather wonderful quote, I think, and it wasn't taken seriously. And of course, I do accept that things they very rarely happen in nice, neat step changes, but I would still like to see some kind of effort towards getting back towards a system of collective security, international rule of law, and agreed, rules of the road. Otherwise, I think the outlook is for chaos and disorder.